Silence. These diamonds secure the European operations, not your street war, Fang.
We control the Asian routes. We dictate terms.
Faster with that wine, girl.
Korean, Italian, and Asian mafia empires came for the blood diamonds. They never saw the war turning on them. The air in the grand gilded hall is thick with the scent of $5,000 cognac and gun oil. Zhao Feng, the storm, cleans his nails with a jade blade. Han Seojun watches the door, a scar on his neck pulsing, and Donatella Lombardi demands a silence so deep you can hear ice melt. Outside, 3 separate armies wait in the rain. Inside, the bosses argue over the red tears, diamonds destined to fund a global coup. Enter Kaylee, a waitress moving with a practiced, submissive slouch. She pours wine with downcast eyes, secretly mapping tactical placements and listening to comms hidden in her ear. When Donatella mocks the lowly help for a slow pour, Kaylee simply smiles. The bosses believe they are the apex predators, but they have just walked into a slaughterhouse where they are the cattle. Kaylee moved through the grand gilded hall like a shadow made of silk and subservience. To the 3 titans seated at the center table, she was less than a person. She was a biological extension of the room's luxury, as unremarkable as the velvet drapes or the heavy gold molding. She kept her slouch pronounced, her shoulders rounded in a way that masked the lethal coil of muscle beneath her skin, and her eyes permanently fixed on the floor. It was the submissive slouch. She had practiced for months, the ultimate camouflage in a world where men like Zhao Feng and Han Seojun only looked at what they feared. As she reached the mahogany sideboard, her fingers danced with a dexterity that would have terrified the bosses. While appearing to straighten the silver cutlery, she pressed a device the size of a grain of rice into the underside of the table. It was a high-frequency transmitter, the first eye in her web. Her heart rate remained a steady, rhythmic 60 beats per minute, even as Han Seojun's cold, scarred gaze drifted toward her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted a crystal glass with a trembling, clumsy hand, playing the role of the intimidated servant to perfection. "The wine is breathing, Donna," Zhao Feng murmured, his voice like the scrape of a whetstone against steel. Kaylee glided toward them, the heavy bottle of vintage red held in a way that hid the tactical compiece nestled deep in her ear. As she leaned in to pour for Donatella Lombardi, Kaylee's internal HUD was already active, mapping the room with predatory precision. She wasn't just looking at the wine. She was measuring the 4-pound trigger pull on the guard's holster by the door and the 3-degree blind spot created by the massive central chandelier. She felt Donatella's cold, blue-shadowed eyes track her every movement. The Italian matriarch's presence was a physical weight in the room, demanding a silence so absolute that the tiny splash of wine hitting the glass sounded like a gunshot. Kaylee felt the heat of a storm in Zhao's jade-handled blade resting just inches from her wrist. She took a mental snapshot of his grip. He was a right-handed striker. He would lead with a lateral slash if she breached his perimeter. Kaylee stepped back, fatting once more into the dim gold light of the periphery. She passed a busboy, another member of her cell, and exchanged a look that lasted only a fraction of a second. The perimeter was set. The black site was no longer a neutral meeting ground. It was a kill box. She reached for a fallen napkin near Han's chair, using the motion to plant a final acoustic sensor near his feet. "They're late," Han growled, the scar on his neck pulsing with irritation. Kaylee stood by the wall, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Through her earpiece, she heard the faint, crackling confirmation of her team. Cerberus, the eyes are live. She looked at the 3 bosses, the men who had ordered the slaughter of her unit, and felt a cold, jagged spike of justice at any cost rise in her chest. To them, she was a ghost. To her, they were already dead. The silence in the gilded hall stretched thin, becoming a physical wire pulled to the snapping point. Han Seojun broke it first, his chair scraping against the marble floor with the harshness of a serrated blade. He didn't look at the diamonds. He looked at Zhao Feng, his eyes narrowed into slits of cold, jagged ice. "The storm has grown quiet, Zhao," Han murmured, the scar on his neck flushing a deep, angry crimson. "You talk of equal shares, while your men move through the Jersey docks like rats in my territory. Do you think I don't see the blades hidden in your sleeves?" Zhao Feng didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his jade-handled blade balanced on the tip of his finger, reflecting the warm gold of the chandelier. Territory is a fluid thing, Han. It flows to those who know how to hold it, Zhao replied, his voice a lethal whisper that seemed to drop the room's temperature. Perhaps if your soul veterans weren't so busy looking backward at their scars, they would see what's coming in front of them. The insult was the final twist of the knife. In a blurred motion of black silk, Han's hand disappeared beneath his jacket and emerged with a sleek, polymer pistol. The metallic clack of the slide chambering a round echoed like a thunderclap. He leveled the barrel directly at the bridge of Zhao's nose. Instantly, Zhao's hand closed around his blade, the jade catching the light as he prepared for a lateral strike that would disembowel the Korean boss before the first casing hit the floor. "Lower it," Donatella Lombardi commanded, her voice not loud, but carrying the absolute weight of a death sentence. She didn't move from the head of the table, yet the atmosphere shifted toward her as if she were a black hole. "We are here to divide the red tiers, not to paint the walls with your petty insecurities. If a single drop of blood hits this tablecloth, neither of you leaves this building alive." Kaylee, standing in the shadows with her hands folded, watched the three-way noose tighten. To anyone else, it was a moment of terrifying volatility, but to her, it was perfect. Through her earpiece, she heard the rhythmic breathing of her team, hidden in the vents and behind the service doors. The bosses were so consumed by their own arrogance, so locked in their cycle of betrayal, that they had become their own distraction. She caught the eye of the busboy across the room and gave a microscopic nod. Han's finger tightened on the trigger, his knuckles white with rage, while Zhao's muscles coiled like a spring. They were the kings of the world, staring down the barrels of their own legacies, entirely unaware that the lowly help was about to kick the chair out from under all of them. Kaylee felt the vibration of her team's readiness humming through the floorboards, a silent countdown only she could hear. The standoff at the table had reached its zenith. Han's pistol was a fixed point of steel against Zhao's defiance, while Donatella sat like a frozen statue of marble and malice. The air was so saturated with the scent of ozone and adrenaline that it felt combustible. It was time to strike the match. With a deliberate, practiced tremor, Kaylee allowed her left heel to slip on the polished marble. She didn't just drop the heavy silver tray, she launched it. The tray collided with the floor with a catastrophic, ringing clang that shattered the oppressive silence of the gilded hall. That sound was the hammer falling. In the heartbeat it took for the bosses to blink, to instinctively look toward the noise. The world dissolved into a blur of synchronized lethality. From the periphery of the room, the invisible staff moved with a speed that defied human reaction. The busboy who had been polishing glasses near the east exit didn't drop his rag. He drew a suppressed submachine gun from beneath the sideboard in a single, fluid arc. 5 seconds, that was the window. In the first second, the two massive enforcers guarding the double doors were erased. Two muffled thips echoed through the hall as subsonic rounds found the soft tissue at the base of their skulls. They collapsed like empty suits, hit before their hands could even reach their waistbands. By the second, the shadow standing behind Donatella, a man she had trusted for a decade, was neutralized. A waiter moving past him didn't use a tray. He used a high-tension garrote, the wire disappearing into the guard's neck before he could draw a breath to scream. In the third and fourth seconds, a crossfire of suppressed fire swept the room's midsection. Every inner circle guard positioned in the shadows was systematically liquidated. They fell in a rhythmic cadence of muffled thuds against velvet and wood, a mechanical harvest of the world's most dangerous men. By the 5th second, the carnage stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The gilded hall was a tomb, the only living souls remaining being the 3 bosses and the staff, who now held them in a tight, tactical circle of gun barrels. Kaylee stood at the center of the debris, no longer slouching. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like a predator who had finally stopped playing with her food. She stepped over the silver tray, her gaze meeting the stunned, pale faces of Zhao, Han, and Donatella. The diamonds on the table sparkled under the chandelier, but their light was cold. "The wine was excellent, wasn't it?" Kaylee asked, her voice a flat, lethal rasp. Through her earpiece, the final confirmation clicked in, room clear. Cerberus, the cage is locked. The heavy, opulent silence that followed the execution of the guards lasted only a heartbeat before Kaylee's hand went to the small transmitter on her belt. "Midnight," she whispered. The world vanished. The massive crystal chandelier didn't just flicker. It died instantly as the main breakers were surged and melted by a remote hack. The grand gilded hall was plunged into a vacuum of absolute, suffocating darkness. In that void, the three bosses were suddenly equalized, stripped of their status, their sight, and their perceived divinity. To Zhao, Han, and Donatella, the room became a terrifying labyrinth of unseen sounds. The rustle of tactical fabric, the rhythmic click of gear, and the distant, frantic shouting of their armies outside, unable to bypass the reinforced, magnetically sealed doors. Then came the green glow. Kaylee pulled her thermal optics down from her brow. The world shifted into a high-contrast ghostscape of neon oranges and deep, bruised purples. Through the lenses, the three bosses were vibrant heat signatures, terrified pulses of light against the cold, dead furniture. She could see the frantic blooming of heat in Han Seojun's chest as his heart rate spiked, and the cold, steady glow of Donatella, who sat perfectly still, a predator even in the dark. "Now," Kaylee commanded. Invisible war began not with a roar, but with a series of surgical, cold-blooded movements. Kaylee's team didn't need light. They moved by the heat of their targets. In the thermal view, the air was traced by the faint, shimmering trails of suppressed muzzles. Kaylee drifted toward the table, her boots silent on the blood-slicked marble. She watched through her visor as Zhao Feng swung his jade blade blindly into the dark, the friction of the metal through the air creating a faint thermal streak. He was fighting ghosts. From the shadows, her team began the sweep. They moved in a pincer formation, their heat signatures overlapping to create a wall of advancing lethality. A burst of suppressed fire erupted from the kitchen doorway, three glowing tracers in the thermal dark that found the last of the inner circle guards trying to crawl toward the light of a cell phone. Kaylee ignored the small fry. Her eyes were locked on the three bright pillars of heat at the center of the room. She was the Cerberus, and she was closing the gate. To the bosses, the darkness was a tomb. To Kaylee, it was her natural habitat. She reached for the glowing heat signature of the blood diamonds on the table, her fingers hovering just inches from the red tears, while her other hand leveled a suppressed pistol at the center of Zhao's forehead. The empires were falling, and they couldn't even see the face of the woman pulling the trigger. In the pulsing green and black void of the thermal dark, the bosses were no longer legends. They were frantic heat signatures struggling against an invisible scythe. Zhao Feng felt the rush of air as a suppressed round hissed past his ear, shattering a crystal decanter behind him. He didn't have a gun, but he had the storm. He spun, his jade blade carving a shimmering thermal arc through the air, parrying the metallic barrel of a tactical carbine that had emerged from the shadows like the snout of a shark. The impact vibration rattled his bones, but he held the line, his senses heightening as his sight failed. Nearby, Han Seojun was a cornered wolf. He fired blindly into the dark, the muzzle flashes of his pistol blooming like miniature suns in the infrared spectrum, momentarily blinding Kaylee's team, but he was pinned. A red laser dot, visible only to the hunters, settled on the center of Han's scarred chest. He didn't see the threat, but Zhao did. The Asian boss, driven by a sudden, primal instinct for survival that overrode decades of rivalry, lunged across the blood-slicked marble. Zhao's shoulder collided with Han, sent the Korean veteran sprawling behind the heavy mahogany table just as a burst of fire shredded the upholstery where his head had been a millisecond before. Han rolled, coming up with his pistol leveled at Zhao's throat, his finger a hair breadth from the trigger. "Why?" Han rasped, his breath hitching in the suffocating dark. "Because they want us all dead, you fool," Zhao hissed, his eyes tracking a thermal signature moving through the rafters above them. "Alone, we are targets. Together, we are a problem." The truce was sealed in a heartbeat of shared desperation. As a tactical operative drifted toward their flank, Han didn't wait to see if Zhao would betray him. He fired over Zhao's shoulder, the bullet finding the narrow gap in the operative's body armor. Simultaneously, Zhao sensed a second hunter closing in from the left. He didn't even look, trusting the storm as he threw his jade blade. The weapon spun through the dark. A silent, rotating streak of heat that buried itself in the throat of the operative, just as they raised their suppressed MP5. For the first time in their violent lives, the Storm and the Scar moved in a synchronized dance of death. Han provided the covering fire, his shots rhythmic and calculated to suppress the invisible line of the waitstaff, while Zhao reclaimed his blade and moved like a ghost through the furniture, neutralizing Kaylee's flankers with surgical precision. They were no longer the heads of competing empires. They were two survivors in a cage, realizing that the only way to kill the Cerberus was to stop fighting each other and start fighting the dark. Kaylee watched through her visor, her jaw tightening. The heat signatures she had expected to flee were now coalescing into a single, jagged wall of resistance. The plan for a clean sweep was fracturing. The bosses weren't just cattle, they were learning to bite back. Donatella Lombardi did not panic. She calculated. While Zhao and Han engaged in their desperate, bloody choreography, the Italian matriarch remained a cold silhouette at the head of the table. Through the chaos of suppressed gunfire and the green-tinted haze of the tactical blackout, she realized the red tears were no longer currency. They were the only leverage left in a room filled with ghosts. She reached out, her fingers closing around the velvet pouch of blood diamonds. They were heavy, cold, and sharp-edged. Donatella knew that Kaylee's team was moving with thermal precision, tracking the heat of their bodies, but the diamonds possessed a different property. She snatched a heavy crystal decanter of high-proof cognac, smashing it against the edge of the mahogany table. The scent of alcohol flooded the air, sharp and volatile. "You want the stones, Cerberus?" Donatella's voice rang out, steady and mocking, cutting through the muffled thuds of the ongoing skirmish. With a snap of her platinum lighter, she ignited the spilled cognac. A wall of blue flame erupted across the table, creating a massive, searing bloom of white-hot interference on Kaylee's thermal visor. The sudden infrared flare was blinding, a tactical sun born in the middle of the kill box. In that moment of digital blindness, Donatella didn't run. She tore open the pouch and flung the blood diamonds into the air with the strength of a woman who had survived 3 decades of Sicilian coups. The diamonds caught the flickering blue light of the fire, spinning like jagged shards of glass. To the thermal-equipped operatives, the air was suddenly filled with hundreds of tiny, cold signatures reflecting the heat of the fire, creating a chaotic snow of false targets. But Donatella wasn't finished. She used the diamonds as more than a visual shroud. As Kaylee's lead operative lunged through the fire to secure the stash, Donatella swung the heavy, jagged remains of the broken decanter. It wasn't a desperate flail. It was a rhythmic, calculated strike. She caught the operative in the throat, the glass shredding through his tactical suit, while the scattering diamonds acted as ball bearings under the boots of the second approaching hunter. The operative stumbled, his feet sliding on the red tears that now littered the blood-slicked marble. He fell hard, and before he could recover his aim, Donatella was over him, using her own weight to drive a steak knife, snatched from the table into the gap of his helmet. "The diamonds were mined in fire," Donatella hissed into the darkness, her face illuminated by the dying blue flames of the cognac. "It's only fitting they help me burn you out." Kaylee, forced to rip her visor off to avoid the permanent retinal burn of the infrared flare, stood in the natural dark, her vision swimming in purple spots. The slaughterhouse had become a chaotic inferno, and the 3 bosses were no longer the cattle, they were the fire itself. The blue flames of the cognac flickered low, casting long, dancing shadows against the gold-leafed pillars of the hall. In the eerie, dim light, Kaylee stepped out from the darkness of the periphery. She moved with the fluid, rhythmic grace of a ghost, her heavy service apron discarded to reveal a black tactical rig beneath. She held a suppressed HK USB in a low-ready position, but she didn't fire. She wanted them to see her. She wanted the last thing these kings of the underworld felt to be the weight of their own forgotten sins. Zhao, Han, and Donatella stood in a jagged triangle amidst the wreckage of their empires. They were bleeding, soot-stained, and breathing in ragged gasps, yet they watched her with the predatory focus of cornered animals. Zhao Feng's jade blade was stained dark, and Han's pistol was leveled at her heart, but Kaylee didn't flinch. She reached up and tapped the comm-piece in her ear, silencing the tactical chatter of her team. "You 3 have spent your lives looking at the horizon, planning wars and dividing maps," Kaylee said, her voice a flat, lethal rasp that seemed to vibrate through the very marble beneath their feet. "You never looked at the people who served your wine. You never looked at the tools you used to build your thrones." She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out a worn, blood-stained patch. It wasn't a triad symbol or a Mafia crest. It was the insignia of a disbanded UN Special Tasks Unit, the Ghost Wardens. She tossed it onto the table, where it landed in a pool of spilled wine near the scattered blood diamonds. 3 years ago, in the borderlands of Myanmar, your 3 syndicates funded a cleansing to secure the mining rights for these very stones, Kaylee continued, her eyes locking onto Donatella with a terrifying green intensity. "My unit was the one you bought, and when we refused to execute the village, you didn't just fire us. You called in a kinetic strike to erase the evidence." The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The Cerberus wasn't a rival mobster or a mercenary for hire. She was the survivor of a ghost they had buried years ago. Han Seo-jun's hand wavered for a fraction of a second, the memory of that Jersey shipment, the one that had funded the strike, flashing behind his scarred eyes. "I didn't come for the diamonds, Donatella," Kaylee whispered, stepping closer until the muzzle of Han's gun was inches from her chest. "The red tears are just bait. I came to watch the world turn on you. I came to show you that even a god can be bled by the help." She raised her own weapon, the laser sight painting a small, steady red dot on Zhao's forehead. The invisible staff had successfully turned the gilded hall into a tomb, and Kaylee was ready to serve the final course. The standoff in the hall shattered as Kaylee's team detonated a flashbang near the service entrance, the white-hot burst providing the cover the 3 bosses needed to retreat. They didn't flee into the night. They were driven like cornered wolves toward the only exit left open, the industrial kitchen. The swinging double doors of the hall closed behind them, and they found themselves in a cavernous, stainless steel labyrinth that smelled of cold iron and stinging bleach. Kaylee stepped into the kitchen a moment later, her tactical boots clicking on the wet tiles. The room was a forest of hanging copper pots and razor-sharp cleavers, a place where she had spent weeks playing the invisible waitress. Now, it was her arena. She signaled her team to hold the perimeter. She wanted the heads of these empires to feel the heat of the stove before they died. "The kitchen is a dangerous place for kings," Kaylee's voice echoed, distorted by the hiss of a ruptured steam line. "Too many sharp edges." The battle became a chaotic, rhythmic dance of metal and mist. Zhao Feng utilized the environment with the predatory grace of a man born to the storm. He reached up, tearing a heavy butcher's hook from its rack and swinging it in a wide, shimmering arc to parry Kaylee's first burst of fire. The sparks flew as the lead rounds ricocheted off the steel industrial fridges. Han Seo-jun, the scarred veteran, moved through the clouds of steam like a ghost. He didn't use his gun. He used a serrated carving knife snatched from a prep station. He lunged at Kaylee from behind a cloud of vapor, his movements concise and professional. Kaylee sensed the shift in the air, dropping her level and pivoting on her right foot to drive an elbow into Han's ribs, a trauma response efficiency that ignored the rising heat of the room. Donatella Lombardi proved she was no stranger to violence. As Kaylee focused on the men, the Italian matriarch activated the industrial deep fryers, throwing a bucket of ice into the boiling oil. The resulting explosion of steam and scalding droplets created a tactical shroud, forcing Kaylee to retreat toward the walk-in freezer. The 3 bosses, fueled by the desperation of a common enemy, began to use the industrial landscape as a weapon. They weren't just brawling, they were conducting a masterclass in survival. Zhao used a heavy metal tray to redirect the steam from a broken pipe toward Kaylee's position, while Han used the clatter of falling pots to mask his footsteps. Kaylee felt the justice at any cost, fire burning in her chest, but for the first time, she felt the pressure of the slaughterhouse turning against her. In the middle of the fire and the steam, she realized these 3 weren't just mobsters. They were survivors of 1,000 wars she had never seen. The kitchen was no longer a room. It was a pressurized chamber of blood and iron, and Kaylee was locked inside with 3 of the most dangerous predators on Earth. The scent of scorched oil and the hiss of escaping steam still clung to their clothes as the 3 bosses retreated toward the rear loading dock, the last threshold between them and the sanctuary of their waiting armies. Zhao Feng gripped his jade blade with white-knuckled intensity, while Han Seojun checked the remaining rounds in his magazine, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. Donatella Lombardi led them, her navy suit torn and stained with the grease of the kitchen, her eyes fixed on the heavy iron doors that led to the rain-slicked alleyway. "Once we reach the perimeter, Cerberus dies," Han rasped, his voice thick with a desperate kind of hope. "My men have the east exit. Zhao, your storm is waiting at the north. We crush her between the hammers." Donatella threw the bolt on the loading dock doors, the heavy metal groaning as it swung open to reveal the midnight downpour. They stepped out into the cold air, expecting the immediate, thunderous reassurance of revving engines, the clack of chambering rounds, and the sight of 300 elite soldiers ready to level the building. Instead, they found a graveyard of machinery and silence. The 3 black SUVs belonging to the Seoul Syndicate were idling, their headlights cutting through the rain, but the drivers sat slumped against the glass, the windshields spider-webbed by single, precise entry holes. To the left, Zhao's transport vans were nothing more than steel coffins, the doors hanging open to reveal the silent forms of his storm enforcers, neutralized before they could even draw their blades. "No," Zhao whispered, the word lost to the wind. He stumbled toward the nearest vehicle, reaching for a radio that only hissed with dead air. Donatella looked toward the street corner where her Lombardi hitmen should have been stationed. The rain washed over the empty sidewalk, illuminated by the flickering glow of a nearby street lamp. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a final, automated text from her security chief that contained only a GPS coordinate and a single word: liquidated. The realization hit them harder than any bullet. The war hadn't just turned inside the Gilded Hall, it had been won before they ever sat down to dinner. Kaylee's cell hadn't just infiltrated the kitchen, they had systematically dismantled 3 global empires in the shadows of the Manhattan streets while the bosses argued over diamonds. The 3 kings stood alone in the rain, stripped of their titles, their soldiers, and their legacies. They were no longer the heads of syndicates. They were 3 fugitives standing in an alleyway, listening to the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of tactical boots echoing from inside the building they had just fled. Kaylee stepped out into the rain, her silhouette framed by the amber light of the doorway. She didn't need to raise her weapon. The sight of their broken empires reflected in the puddles at their feet was a more lethal blow than any she could deliver. "Your armies didn't fail you," Kaylee said, her voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "They just didn't exist in a world that already moved on." Driven by the cold lash of the rain and the realization that there was nowhere left to run, the 3 bosses retreated back into the maw of the Gilded Hall. They didn't return as rulers, but as ghosts haunting the ruins of their own making. Above them, the building groaned, the structural integrity failing as Kaylee's team triggered the secondary demolition charges. Dust drifted down like gray snow, settling on the blood-slicked marble and the scattered, forgotten diamonds. Kaylee was waiting for them in the center of the debris. She had discarded her firearm, her hands wrapped in tactical tape, her eyes burning with the justice at any cost, fire that had sustained her through years of shadow. She didn't want a clean execution anymore. She wanted to feel the life leave the men who had erased her world. The bosses didn't hesitate. They moved as a single, jagged unit of desperation. Zhao Feng led the charge, the storm of his jade blade flickering through the dust-heavy air in a series of lethal, horizontal slashes. Kaylee slipped inside the first strike, the air of the blade humming past her ear and drove a rigid palm into Zhao's chest. The impact sent him staggering, but before she could follow through, Han Seojun was there. The Korean veteran moved with the rhythmic, brutal efficiency of the Seoul underworld, using his serrated knife to force Kaylee into a defensive shell. He wasn't trying to kill her with a single blow. He was creating openings. As Kaylee parried Han's thrust, Donatella Lombardi lunged from the periphery, using a heavy shard of fallen chandelier glass as a makeshift dagger. The battle was a dance of death in a collapsing cathedral. Kaylee was a whirlwind of motion, her trauma response efficiency allowing her to track 3 separate lines of attack in the dim, flickering light. She caught Han's wrist, the bone snapping with a sickening crack, but Donatella's glass blade found purchase, slicing a shallow red line across Kaylee's shoulder. Kaylee didn't flinch. She used the pain to center herself, pivoting on her heel to deliver a spinning back kick that sent the Italian matriarch crashing into a marble pillar. A massive ceiling beam tore loose above them, crashing into the dining table and sending the red tears scattering into the cracks of the floor like literal drops of blood. Zhao lunged again, his jade blade aimed at Kaylee's throat. She didn't move away. She moved forward, catching the hilt of the knife and driving her forehead into Zhao's nose. As he fell, she snatched the blade from his weakening grip. She stood over the three of them, the hall vibrating with the final, rhythmic thuds of the building's heart stopping. They were beaten, broken, and buried in the rubble of their empires. Kaylee looked down at the jade blade, then at the three legends of the underworld who were now just three people bleeding on a dirty floor. The clean sweep was almost complete. The dust of the gilded hall didn't settle. It hung in the air like the ghost of the fortunes squandered within its walls. Kaylee stood amidst the wreckage, her silhouette a jagged tear in the haze of pulverized marble and smoke. She looked down at the jade blade in her hand, the weapon of a fallen king, and let it slip from her fingers. It hit the stone with a final, hollow ring that signaled the end of the ghost warden's vendetta. Through the settling debris, a single, rhythmic coughing sound echoed, a fragile tether to the world of the living. Donatella Lombardi crawled from beneath the shattered remains of the mahogany table, her navy suit reduced to rags, her dark hair matted with blood and ash. She was the only one left standing, or rather, the only one left breathing. To her left, the storm had finally passed. Zhao Feng lay still, his eyes fixed on a ceiling that no longer existed. To her right, Han Seojun was buried under the weight of a fallen gold-leafed pillar, his legacy crushed alongside his bones. Donatella reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against a single, red tear wedged in a floorboard crack. She clutched the diamond, but it offered no warmth, no power. The war had turned, and in its wake it had stripped her bare. Her hitmen were dead in the streets, her bank accounts were being drained by Kaylee's hackers, and the Lombardi name was now a mark of death rather than a seal of authority. She was the queen of a graveyard. Kaylee watched her for a long moment, the justice at any cost fire in her chest finally fatting into a cold, hollow ache. She didn't deliver a finishing blow. To a woman like Donatella, living in the ruins of her own empire, stripped of the fear she once commanded, was a far more agonizing sentence than a bullet. "You're a ghost now, Donatella," Kaylee said, her voice a low rasp that carried over the distant sound of approaching sirens. "Just like the ones you made in Myanmar." Without another word, Kaylee turned and vanished into the shadows of the loading dock, merging with the rain and the night. Behind her, Donatella sat in the center of the wreckage, clutching a useless stone, as the blue and red lights of a world she no longer controlled began to reflect in the puddles of blood. The empires had fallen, the diamonds were lost to the dust, and a new, colder shadow was already beginning to stretch across the city.